Male, obviously, when you start talking about these broad categories, you got to be careful because, you know, where do they come from? You know, some of the North Africans are darker skinned. They may have African blood in them, or more North European blood, and so there's different shapes. But in general speaking, the pattern design that I generally wind up doing is something closer or analogous toward the white male. Or the North European or the Central European shape design. This is a more conservative design. Again, this is actually a reconstruction. He had a hair transplant done before. The angles are poor, density is poor. It didn't do much temporal rebuild on him. It was a more of a conservative design to rebuild the hairline and very similar though. But you can see that his hairs are actually quite coarse and straight, so you want to be very careful in terms of the angulation because again, it looked grafty and artificial, almost like an Asian hair, but the shape is different. This is a Iranian patient where he just really wanted more central density. Obviously, we reinforced the hairline, but we filled up the whole central mid-scalp as well, going back toward the crown. The Hispanic male is a little bit more convoluted in terms of cultural identity, because if you think about the history of the Caribbean basin of the idea of Hispanic, you have the African slave trade coming through, you have some of the indigenous Indians that, if you think about where the history they came from, they came over the Bering Strait, so they have more of an Asian look. And then you've got the conquistadors and the white colonialists that came over and settled. And so there's this intermingling of races, and you can go to Dominican Republic and they look primarily African. You can go to different parts of the Caribbean basin and see a different variety. So when we talk about the word Hispanic, it's a very, very culturally mixed one. It doesn't mean very much. So you have to look within that patient you're seeing, and besides sort of the cultural bounds, you have to look at sort of the ethnic, geographic bounds that are made up in that person. And so it can be more white, it can be more African, it can actually be more Asian. It just depends on what mix they have. So I know that adds a level of complexity. This is, I just put up a Hispanic one. It doesn't really mean much. This could also be just a standard, you know, white reconstruction. And this is the power of actually of the central forelock and the little widow's peak to create that visual frame that's really, really nice, even though he didn't dye his hair on the after result. So the point of this photograph is just to get you to understand there's a lot of mixed marriages today, and the concept is not to be so dogmatic in your concept of race, because today obviously it's so much more broadly understood and conceived. So the goal is for you to think beyond that. But these are just sort of general boundaries I want you to be thinking about that we really haven't introduced earlier in the course, because I think this is more of an advanced topic. In terms of technical considerations, these are things that I don't want you to really get bogged down on, but they're worth knowing so that you don't just go and have an African patient or Asian patient and just start the harvest and start everything as the same, because it is different. The curly nature of the black hair makes it harder to harvest in many respects, because there's a higher level of potential transection. So I don't take thin strips out, I take wider strips out. And if we use a multi-blade, you want to be very careful of transection. We often tend to take just a single strip and have the assistants work a little harder on the back end to get that dissected. The donut closure, really, because it's so curly, you really don't need a trichophytic closure. In fact, I think you're adding a level of risk with that. I mean, it's not to say you shouldn't do it, but there are multiple levels. One is that the curly nature covers the scar quite well. The second thing, you want to minimize tension, specifically also on African, because the risk of keloid formation is higher, and so you're adding a higher incidence potentially of that. So I rarely do a trichophytic on an African patient, but not to say if your colleague does it, it's wrong, or if you do, it's wrong, but there's some thoughts that you may want to think about. Plus, the curly nature of it, we talked about pseudoficulatus barbae, and you're worried about that hair shaft then not growing out the right way. So I'm not here to try to further traumatize a curly hair, so I don't do many trichophytic closures, just as a subtle point. In African patients. Recipient sides, the angles are not so critical because it comes out curly, and you don't need to dense pack this, because the way that it dances across the scalp, it actually creates a lot of visual density already. But I do look at the angles. I do look at if they have native hairs, where their hairs are angled, so that the way that the shaft comes out, I will mimic their natural growth patterns. And this is just a graft dissection. We don't want to get very much into this, but because of the low contrast to contrast between scalp to hair, and the fact that it's so curly, you could potentially use slightly larger grafts of difollicular units. But again, this is a very advanced idea. I just want to introduce the concepts more than you're trying to furiously write down all this information. But it's also sent to you in in a slide format. If you don't have that, we can get Karen to get it to you. And then for Asians, I think the donor harvesting is pretty similar to Caucasians. There is potentially, theoretically, more keloid risk in an Asian. I don't think it's significantly that much higher if you're careful with your work, but there is an incidence of keloids. Recipient sites, you really want to, as we talked about, keeping every angle really, really low for the Caucasian patient, you want to be doubly certain to do that in the Asian patient, specifically because it's so straight, round, black against lighter skin that there's a risk of it looking grafty and artificial. So I particularly stay very, very low, but it's just an idea just to remind you to stay low no matter really what you do, except maybe the African patient, you don't have to be quite as rigorous with that concept. Graft dissection tends to be easier if they don't go white because of the dark hair color and the thicker caliber of the shaft, and the placement can be somewhat easier as well for Asian patients. So conclusions, the key is just to be cognizant of the hair disorders. Obviously, we can't summarize that in a short time, and like the whole framework of this course is not meant to give you all the information. It's to say, hey, I need to go back and read that. I need to learn more about it. I got to understand that this is not the same thing. And so that's really what I want to hopefully get you to begin to understand. Good. Any questions?